The United States government has reached a new milestone in this debt crisis. According to official data from the Treasury, the federal government now owes more than $38 trillion. In just 2.5 months, $1 trillion of new debt has been added. Let's take a closer look at how the government performed in 2025 compared to previous years. First, remember that the government does not follow a standard calendar year. Instead of ending on December 31st, the federal fiscal year ends on September 30th. For fiscal year 2025, the government overspent by $1.78 trillion. That number is slightly better than the previous year's deficit of $1.83 trillion. Some might call that progress, but others would argue that it is far from encouraging. The question is, how does the government keep falling deeper into debt? The answer is simple. It consistently spends more money than it collects. That shortfall forces the Treasury to borrow the difference, adding directly to the national debt. These deficits do not happen evenly throughout the year. For example, in April, the government often runs a surplus because that is when tax payments are due. Many Americans pay their income taxes that month, and business owners make estimated payments, which temporarily boosts revenue. But outside of those few months, the government continues to spend far more than it brings in. Let's examine the full fiscal year numbers. For 2025, total revenue collected was about $5.23 trillion. The Treasury often lists this as $5,235 billion, but either way, it means the same thing. Half of that revenue came from personal income taxes, around $2.65 trillion. The next largest portion came from payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare. These are the automatic deductions taken from every paycheck or paid directly by self-employed workers through self-employment tax. Corporate income taxes added roughly $452 billion. Customs duties and tariffs contributed another $195 billion. When you add it up, the government collected a little over $5.2 trillion in revenue, yet total spending reached $7 trillion. The difference, about $1.78 trillion, represents the deficit for the year. That entire amount must be financed through new borrowing, pushing the debt even higher. Now, where does all of this money go? The largest expenses are Social Security benefits and healthcare programs like Medicare and Medicaid. But there is another category that has become just as alarming. Interest payments on the national debt reached $970 billion in 2025. Think about that for a moment. Nearly $1 trillion just to pay interest. The government now spends more on interest than it does on the entire U.S. military, which cost $917 billion that same year. Almost 19% of every tax dollar collected went toward paying interest alone. If the government wanted to balance the budget, it would face impossible choices. Even if it stopped paying all Social Security benefits tomorrow, which it cannot legally or politically do, the budget would still not be balanced. Social Security payments total about $1.5 trillion per year, while the annual deficit is $1.8 trillion. Cutting these benefits would affect 72 million Americans, and no elected official would survive the backlash. The same goes for Medicare and Medicaid. These programs support seniors and low-income households, and cutting them would be political suicide. So, if those cannot be touched, what about interest payments? The government cannot skip those either. Failing to pay creditors would cause an immediate default, collapsing global confidence in U.S. debt. The dollar would lose its reserve status and financial markets would panic. This is why the Federal Reserve is lowering interest rates, to reduce the government's borrowing costs and slow the growth of interest expenses. But those lower rates only apply to new debt issued going forward. The existing debt still carries the higher interest rates from past years. Even if rates return to near zero, interest costs would still be measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. And if the Fed did lower rates too far, inflation would return with force. Cheap borrowing always leads to higher prices, and the government would once again be trapped between two bad outcomes. Keep rates high and pay more interest, or cut rates and risk runaway inflation. The debt continues to grow at a rapid pace. The bigger the balance, the more the government must pay in interest. Reducing those costs by $100 or even $200 billion would not fix a $1.8 trillion deficit. So what else could be cut? The next major category is income security, which costs around $72 billion. This includes programs like food assistance, housing vouchers, and aid for low-income families. Cutting those would affect over 40 million Americans and barely make a difference to the overall deficit. Other categories, like veterans' benefits and public infrastructure, are too small to move the needle. This is the dilemma facing every administration. No one wants to make unpopular cuts or raise taxes significantly, so the government keeps spending more than it earns. The easiest path is to print more money and let inflation erode the debt in real terms. But that hurts the middle class and low-income earners most. It does not matter which party is in control. Republicans and Democrats both continue to overspend. Under President Bush, the national debt soared. President Obama added even more. President Trump spent beyond both of them, and President Biden has already surpassed them all. Every administration promises fiscal discipline, and every administration leaves behind a larger debt. At this point, there is no clear way out. The system depends on constant borrowing to function. Interest costs grow with the debt, and new spending adds to both. Even if growth remains steady, the math no longer works in favor of balance. So here we are, $38 trillion in debt, rising by nearly $1 trillion every few months, with no credible plan to stop it. Thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think will happen when the national debt crosses 40 trillion. Will the system hold together, or are we heading toward a breaking point? Please subscribe for more updates, and thank you for your continued support.